Good evening and welcome to our much anticipated author talk and finale event for One Book, One Boulder. My name is Patrice Madere and I am the Director of Community Engagement and Strategic Partnerships at the Boulder Library Foundation. Over the course of the last 3 months, we have had an opportunity to read So You Want to Talk About Race, engage in a series of programs like discussion groups, workshops, and story times. And it is our sincere hope that by participating, you've gained the tools needed to grow and equip yourself to take action on the topic of racial equity. To say that it has been a stressful week for us all would be an understatement at best. Tonight promises to offer us an opportunity to learn and reflect on ways to continue these conversations, regardless of what the next 4 years may look like. On behalf of the Boulder Library Foundation and the Boulder Public Library, we are deeply honored to hear from Ijeoma Oluo, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race, Assétou Xango, this evening's facilitator, and our Library and Arts Director, David Farnan. Since its inception in 1974, the Boulder Library Foundation has sought to provide funding for services that help Boulder residents develop and grow. By identifying needs, developing funding mechanisms, and encouraging community engagement, the Foundation is delighted to play a role in preparing Boulder for a more engaged future through our library and beyond. Funding a transformational program of this nature would not have been possible without our donors' generous help and support, so I want to thank our donors for their incredible kindness and generosity. If you'd like to learn more about the Foundation, I invite you to visit our website at boulderlibraryfoundation.org. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping notes that I would like to highlight to ensure this event's success. As this is an official Boulder Public Library program, all library conduct guidelines and policies apply. If you would like more information, please visit boulderlibrary.org for these and other tips on internet safety and privacy. In addition to this, we have also compiled 3 guidelines for tonight's event. 1. Listen to and amplify marginalized voices. If you identify as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or person of color, we invite you to put an asterisk before your questions and comments so that we can be sure to give marginalized voices a chance to speak and be heard. I welcome you to add your questions to the chat throughout the evening, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can in the available time. 2. Hold space and give grace. To the best of your ability, ask questions that will lead to your own greater understanding, while also making sure to leave space for others to speak, share, and understand. Ask yourself if you're stereotyping, underestimating, or insulting a fellow community member. When listening, give others grace. We will all stumble and make mistakes as we grow. 3. No racist statements or slurs will be tolerated. People who identify as BIPOC are free to talk about their lived experiences as needed. And now I am excited to introduce David Farnan to talk more about this year's program.
Thank you, Patrice. It's a pleasure to be here with you and an honor. And to welcome Ijeoma to this culminating event for the 2021 Book One Boulder. I'm so pleased to be here. We have so many people to thank. I'm deeply indebted to the community and to a number of community leaders, both in Boulder and beyond. Primary among them, I think I need to recognize Assétou and Stephen, Congressman Joe Neguse, our city council members, Ginny Joseph, Mary Young, and Rachel Friend for their participation. I'd like to call out Nikki McCord, my friend, Audrey Fryer, Janet Damon, Sean O'Neill, Korea White. And then I need desperately to acknowledge my staff members who pulled this off. Kathy, Julianne, Jamie, Jess, Adam, Emily, Celine. They've done a brilliant job, and I can tell you 12 months ago when we first started to plan this event and think about, we obviously had no idea that this was going to be as impactful as it actually became, but we knew how important having this long overdue conversation about race and racism in our community and in our society was for our community of Boulder. And I know for certain, and I don't want to call my crew out, but we were sitting around and, there was a lot of like, no, I'm not sure we can pull this off. And I felt confident in the team. And as events unfolded in 2020, it became more and more imperative that we have this conversation. One book programs have some history in public libraries, and the design is to have a conversation around a singular book that will better inform our community. And as Patrice mentioned, we live in difficult and uncertain times. And as a librarian, I'm a person who reads. I like to think I think a lot, and I think a lot about our history. And I am reminded in these difficult and uncertain times how our friends and our neighbors and our community members of color have lived in these uncertain and difficult times for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the importance of this conversation for us to begin to discuss racism in our community, in our lives, is so important. And I believe that Ijeoma, I'm so grateful. I believe she wrote a perfect book. She wrote a perfect book for Boulder. It is a story of a Black woman growing up in a white society, in a white community, in a white culture, and finding that way. And it's not simply about the experiences that she lived, but rather it provides us with the tools that we need to confront that racism now and in the future. So for that, I'm deeply, deeply appreciative both to our community, to our partners, to our community leaders who participated in this with us. We're in the neighborhood of 3,000 or 4,000 people that we know in Boulder who participated, and I'm deeply appreciative of your participation. I hope that you will continue this work. I think we've just begun. And I want to thank the foundation for being willing to take on difficult issues. They've not only decided to take it on, but make it the primary issue of who they are to take on difficult conversations in our community. And so welcome everyone tonight. Thank you very much to our community. And Patrice, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, David. Now I am pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ijeoma Oluo, and our facilitator, Assétou Xango. Ijeoma Oluo is the author of this year's one book, So You Want to Talk About Race. Ijeoma is a Seattle-based writer and speaker, and her work on social issues, she's been working on social issues such as race and gender, and has been published in pieces in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Elle Magazine, NBC News, and more. Ijeoma boasts a series of inspiring accolades, as she was named one of the most influential people in Seattle by Seattle Magazine, one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle by Seattle Met, and one of the Roots 100 most influential Americans in 2017 and 2018. Ijeoma's upcoming book will be released on December 1st, and it's called Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. It will be available for purchase through bookshop.org or at your local bookstore. Ijeoma, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Joining Ijeoma as our facilitator this evening is Assétou Xango. Assétou was born and raised in Colorado, a poet and community activist. They have been performing poetry since 2009 and were featured on HBO's Brave New Voices in 2010. In 2017, they were featured in Westwood's Top 100 Creators. Assétou has coached a series of our workshops during One Book, One Boulder, and we are truly delighted to have you joining us all the way from Ireland this evening. For those of you who want to actively participate, I invite you to please share your questions and comments on YouTube or Facebook Live throughout tonight's event. We have carved out a segment at the end of tonight's program during which Ijeoma will be answering questions. Please remember that if you identify as a BIPOC, add an asterisk before your question or comment, and we'll do our best to answer questions in the available time. But now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Ijeoma. Take it away.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction, and it is a pleasure to be here. And I really want to thank the City of Boulder, Boulder Public Library, for having me and for everyone who worked hard to pull this event together. I'm just going to talk for a little while because I'm actually most excited, about my conversation with Assétou, about answering your questions. And so I'm going to try to keep my book blabbing to somewhat a minimum. But I like to, when speaking in environments like Boulder, talk a little bit about why I wrote this book. Boulder's a city I love. I used to travel to Denver and Boulder at least once a month for work in my past life before I was a writer. And part of why I loved the Boulder area so much was that politically, socially, it felt very similar to Seattle, only with a different landscape, a little bit of a different flavor. But if you have any questions as to whether or not this is an area that needs to talk about race, I think the similarities to Seattle are also hold true in that sense. The truth is that I am a writer on issues of race and identity primarily because I grew up in a politically liberal, majority white, fairly economically well-off area. And a space like that can be very difficult to grow up as BIPOC, especially as a Black person. There is a collective gaslighting of people of color in majority white areas, especially majority white politically liberal areas, that like to pretend like there is no problem with race. Race doesn't even exist. It's kind of beyond race. Everyone recycles, everyone votes a particular way. People seem financially comfortable. There are no problems. But what happens when you have an extreme majority of whiteness is that BIPOCs can fall between the cracks and kind of, be erased in the numbers that we put out to tell a story of prosperity. And my family, we were definitely one of those families that had fallen between the cracks. And we grew up like many Black people in the area in extreme poverty. We moved from home to home. We were continuously neglected as far as services and community kind of support. And yet, because this is a politically liberal area, nobody really wanted to say why. It was never because we were Black. It was never because we were different. We were just unlucky, or maybe we weren't trying hard enough. And yet, whenever I encountered other families of color, especially other Black families in the area, the story was the same. But when you don't have a centralized location, when your remaining neighborhoods of color are being rapidly gentrified, when the overall statistics look so rosy, there ends up being this kind of collective denial of the reality that you face. And the truth is that socially, it is just as isolating, if not more, to be Black in an area like this. It is just as stigmatizing, it's just as discriminatory, and the numbers bear that out, but also the lived experience of many people of color, many BIPOCs, many Black people in the area. And so I became incredibly observant. You have to be when no one is saying what's happening, when people aren't going to come out and shout a racial slur at you. They're not going to explain that you're not getting this job because you're Black. They're not going to explain that they're wary of you because of the color of your skin. You have to figure out what's not being said. You have to figure out the rules of engagement in this society where you are not in the majority, and not knowing the rules can cost you not only your jobs, your ability to get a good education, but your livelihood, your sense of safety. And so being observant and loving writing, I came into writing, and I came into writing a little late in life. I had loved writing as a child. It's what I had always wanted to do, but set it aside and really kind of focused on goals that would help lift my family out of poverty. And there was never really the messaging that writing was how you would do that as a Black woman. I started writing after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. And I actually remember feeling desperately wanting someone to say something and wanting to connect to my community. And I was actually in Denver for work. And I was sitting at a table and hearing two white men a few tables down just talk about how they thought that this kid was a thug who got what he deserved. And recognizing as I looked around the room that I was not in a space where I could safely speak up. And I recognized that there were many spaces where I lived in Seattle that were similar. I started writing because I needed to know that I wasn't alone, and because I needed to find a way to reach people who said they loved me and cared about me, to help them understand why we needed to be talking about these issues and why we really couldn't ignore it. So I started writing in Facebook, social media, on my blog, and it started to take off. Now, to be fair, I want to be honest and say I lost most of my friends, like right away. Probably 80% of the people I associated with kind of disappeared. But almost immediately, there were other people, especially Black people in the Seattle area at first, then other people of color, and then around the country, and then eventually internationally, who started reacting to my words. And people were coming to me kind of drawn by the sincerity of what I was saying. It was clear that I wasn't trying to build a writing career. I was just trying to find connection and trying to honestly describe, the state that I lived in, that my family lived in, that my community lived in. And so people started asking to republish my work, and I started writing independent pieces. And then I took a leap in my mid-30s to write full-time. Almost a few months after I quit my job, I was approached to see if I wanted to write a book. And my agent asked me, and I said no. And I kind of describe in the beginning of So You Want to Talk About Race the reasons why I didn't really want to write it. The truth is, the title's a bit of a it's a bit of a mistitle, because I don't like talking about race. Very few people do, especially people of color. And so when my agent asked me, would you like to write a book? I thought of how many words that was, how many months of effort of talking about race that would entail. And it just really did not seem like something I would want to do. So I said no. And she said, well, can you please think about this? I think that you have a way of explaining things that people hear. And I said, all right, I'll think about it. And so over the coming months, I was just recognizing a couple of patterns. I had this in the back of my head. Do I want to write this book? Do I not? Do I want to write this book? Do I not? And a couple of things I noticed. One was that everyone was asking me to write the same article basically over and over again. And I was getting incredibly frustrated because what it showed was that people weren't really engaging with the root causes to the racism we see day in and day out. So I would, get asked, can you write an article about, why a Black person gets cops called on at Starbucks? Can you write another article about why a Black person gets cops called on them in a barbecue? And I was like, well, it's the same reason. And the frustration with the fact that we couldn't move past these, initial, ideas to talk about these root causes and move towards solutions, that we were always being reactionary, was really getting to me. And it didn't feel like my work was contributing to something that brought that conversation forward. And then at the same time, I was getting emails. So I was getting emails from people saying, please don't tell anyone, but I don't know what intersectionality is. Can you please, go on and explain to me why, what the school to prison pipeline is? I don't know. Please don't tell anybody. And I would see online that people would get into these huge arguments about important terminology, and no one on either side of the argument actually knew what these words meant, knew why it was important to understand these things. So I started asking people about their problems talking about race. And what I noticed were, I asked this question and I was expecting a flood of responses from white people, because in all honesty, so often the idea is that this work is for white people, right? It's white people who need to understand. We're going to educate and build a kinder, gentler white person. So I was expecting, when I asked, what problems are you having talking about race, to just hear from all these white people. And I did. But I also heard from a ton of BIPOC. And a lot of what I heard was something that I had to pause and realize that perhaps my career as a writer, in this field had shielded me from the reality of what it means to be a person of color in a society that doesn't talk about race. And so a lot of people were saying things like, something happens to me at work that's racist, and I try to bring it up, and then people ask me to prove it, and I don't know how to prove it. Or I try to talk about something that's happening, and I don't have the terminology for it, and so people are dismissing me. Or I don't know what to do when things start to get heated so that I don't feel threatened, or so that I don't get fired or lose an important relationship. And when I had these kind of conversations, I realized that, of course, we are all kind of brought up in the same education system. We are all collectively told that racism isn't something we could actually solve. We're all denied the language to have effective, productive conversations on issues of race. And when I realized that the harm for that was going to be doubly on populations of color, because you have not only the harm of what's being done to you, but then the added, denial when you try to bring it up of it actually happening, that I realized I could write this book. So my goal for this book was really to create something that people would carry around and use and pull out to help them as they try to solve real problems. So I imagined that each chapter could stand alone. And if you said, I remember, this seems to be an intersectionality issue. I remember this chapter, let me go back to it. And you would have this thing you would keep with you that would kind of, promote healthy conversations and productive conversations that have a better chance of leading to solutions. When I looked, I couldn't find anything like it at the time. I couldn't find a book that really took this, important high-level race theory, that scholars, especially Black scholars, have spent generations working on, and said, okay, so this is what it means when you go to work. This is what it means with your family and your church. This is how you can use these concepts to, focus on issues in your day-to-day life. And so that was the goal for the book. And so for the book, I kind of focused on questions. Each chapter is based around questions, if you've read the book, and most of you have. And these were questions that I felt like many people of color would recognize and say, oh, okay, I know this question. Or questions that sometimes I wish people would ask, because people act without asking the questions that would inform them as to, what to do. And so each chapter, I split each chapter in half. Half is kind of personal anecdotes, and half is the kind of factual statistics, and then what to do if you're having a conversation about these issues. And I split it up for two reasons. One is, when I started writing, like I said, I started writing really on a personal level with no desire to really, no plan to be a professional writer, just trying to connect people I knew. And so my first essays were always very personal, because I assumed if I was writing to coworkers, to community members, that maybe what they were missing was an understanding of how these issues were impacting people they cared about. And so I started writing in that way, and it became really effective. And I found that at the time, and honestly still today, there's this idea that you can write one of two ways when writing about social issues. You can either write personal narrative, or you can write, respectable, factual, texts. And you can't mix them. And if you add the personal to the statistics, to the texts, then you are sullying it. You're making it about emotion. But I stood in the truth that the way in which these issues impact me in my life is fact, and is valid, and is part of why we need to address these issues. And it actually is evidence as well. And so it had worked for me before, and I've always had this rule as a writer. I always want to read something that I wrote and recognize it as my work. And so for the book, I decided I was going to incorporate that as well. But I also incorporated it for two practical reasons. One was because I wanted BIPOCs who open the book to recognize that their stories are worth telling. I wanted people to open and say, you know what? Something like this happened to me, and it's in a book. And no, maybe it didn't kill me, but it's worth documenting. And that pain was real, and I had the right to feel it. And I wanted it to be in a major book. I wanted people to see parts of their lives and know that their story was worth telling. I wanted people to understand that this was coming from a place of experience, and it was experience like theirs. But also, the more pessimistic reason was that I have long known that even over 400 years into this horrific system of white supremacy in the United States, that you have to have the pain for many white people to engage with the subject. If they don't see it, if it doesn't pull at the heartstrings, if it doesn't become something they personally feel, our words aren't enough, the evidence isn't enough, the hundreds of years of history isn't enough. And so that's part of the pessimistic reason why it's in there as well. And I would say it's been effective on both fronts. So I hear regularly from BIPOCs that, this was maybe the first time they've read a book that they really felt like they were in the pages. And then I hear from white people, I didn't realize this was an issue, but I've been in, when you said this one thing happened to you, I felt that pain and I realized I have to do something. And for me, at the end of the day, if it gets people to do something, then it matters. If it gets people to have productive conversation that leads to action, I will do it. But I am sad that we have to, at this day and age, that we have to do this much. We shouldn't have to. But we keep doing the work. And I even say this in the book, so often these conversations don't turn out well for BIPOCs. They end up being painful. We can lose relationships. Very rarely are we thanked for bringing these issues to light, even if we are trying to get closer to someone, even if we are trying to solve a real problem. And yet we do it anyway. And we do it because we have to. We do it because it's killing us. The truth is that race is one of the most important factors to determine your health, wealth, and well-being in this country. And until we can talk about it effectively and find areas for change, it will continue to be this way. And just because you're not talking about it, just because you're not learning about it, just because you avoid it, doesn't make you exempt for the ways in which you participate in systems that harm populations of color. So we have to move forward. And I would say that every year it has been vital. But if you can't see in 2020 with everything that has happened this year, then you don't want to. I like to say a lot of times that people who say we don't need to talk about race are like the flat earthers of social justice. All the evidence is there. It has been there for a very long time. And at this point, sorry. That was weird. My watch set off my radio. At this point, if you don't see it, it's because you don't want to. Like, you really want to believe the earth is flat. And there isn't really a conversation or a book that's going to bring you along. So then the question is how and why. So I wrote this book not for people who think we should never talk about race, not for people who think that race isn't a problem, but for people who maybe are afraid or don't know how to bring those conversations into someplace productive. I believe there are enough of us who understand that racism and violent white supremacy are a problem in our society, that we can focus and keep our conversations in that space and move it towards action and make a real difference. And I believe that we can do more with that, with these sorts of productive conversations had in good faith, than we would trying to win over someone who doesn't even think I'm a human being. And so I think that, where we have these conversations and how we have these conversations is vital. It is really important that we have these conversations with care and with an eye towards action, because lives are on the line. And so I hope that as you have engaged with my book, that has you thinking not only about how you can have these conversations, but how you can honor those conversations with action. And I hope that the conversations we have today will continue that. So now I'm going to ask Assétou to join me here, and we're going to continue our conversation.
Thank you so much, Ijeoma. Thank you so much. I know that our viewers are giving you a round of applause. I have so many questions, but I only get 15 minutes with you before the most important part when we turn to our community for your question and answers. The chat has already been lighting up with those questions, but if you do have a question, please put it in the chat wherever you're viewing this. And if you are a BIPOC, Black or Indigenous person of color, make sure you put an asterisk so we can move you to the front of the line. So Ijeoma, wow, thank you so much for sharing yourself and really sharing your life with us, both through the book and through that presentation. I really appreciated when you said that our stories as Black and Indigenous people of color are worth telling. And that was something that really stood out to me in the book, was that every chapter began with a personal story, with your personal story, and then led into this larger, systemic oppression that is known as racism, and the statistics to back it up. And I found myself experiencing both tension around reading those stories, especially the ones that I have also lived through, but then also a catharsis around that being told. And I wondered if you experienced that in writing them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because when I'm writing essays, I really only, unless it's something happening right at the moment, I usually only delve in things I've processed to the point where I can, have thoughts around it. But when it came to the book, and I was trying to think for each topic, what was the story? There were things there that I had not processed at all, that I hadn't gone back to. And so, yeah, there were chapters where I remember, like, when I get stressed, I need to sleep. Like, I just have this, and I would write a couple paragraphs and then I would feel like I wouldn't have the energy to even stand up, and I also learned not to read anymore. So I do not read that book. I don't do readings of it. And just because it was painful to write, it's still painful at times to go through, and it becomes performative. Like, I feel like I went through it once for people to read, and I don't need to go through it again. And so I don't. And so probably 2 years ago, I stopped and I just said, no, I'm not doing any more readings. I'm not delving back into this pain that I put all this effort to put out there just so that people could have like the in-person experience of watching a Black woman's pain, and so I don't do it. But yeah, there were definite times, the chapter around like my brother, that was brutal, and I hadn't sat with it, sitting with something that happens to someone you love, I hadn't had a chance to go back in my head and work through that. So that was a really tough one. And that was when I remember I tried to read once and couldn't. So there were times where it was tough. And then there were times where it helped. I think it was always, once I had worked through the second half of the chapter, where I got to the solutions, it kind of helped pull me through in a way, because I was able to put it to something productive, and pull it through and see it myself as part of this system, as part of this process, in a way that was helpful. It is nice in a way to have these things and to know that they're at least going towards something that might help other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was my experience in reading it too. It's like, this is happening. Oh yeah, right. Okay, we can do this. So then I wonder, in having this language around what is going on, right? Both on this personal and interpersonal level, and then also on this larger scale, does that make it easier or harder when you see or experience racism?
I think it can make it. There's a couple of things. I think it absolutely can make it easier where you feel more like a whole person. I think there's a way in which, when you don't have words for it, what you have then is this unease that you walk around with that you can't describe. And oftentimes you're only aware of it when you're in its absence. Like, let's say you're around a room full of Black people, and then suddenly you're breathing differently and you're not quite sure what that is and why the air is so full. And when you don't have words for when you go back outside and it constricts again, you really do think it could be so many things, because the world is not telling you it's race. The world is telling you it could be so many other things. It could be you, it could be luck. And so the words are vital. And I do think that denying people the words to say what's happening is a tool of oppression. But there is a thing about it though, because once you know what it is and you're open to that, then you're also open to feeling the impact in a way that often you may not have been before. I have found it was brutal. You know, I used to be someone that people would say never cried. I would go to funerals, I wouldn't cry, nothing. When I started writing and really started opening myself up to this, I cry at the drop of a hat. I cry all the time. And I remember at first wondering, like, am I depressed? Like, what's happening? But I know what depression feels like. And for me, it doesn't feel like crying all the time. It feels like doing nothing all the time. And I was like, okay, no. But then I noticed I could also cry at joy all the time. And I never did. You know, joy never made me cry. I never felt it to that level. And there's something about opening up your humanity to the full experience, even when it's painful, that allows you to also be open to the joy that's there. And I think that a lot of times, you know, speaking as a Black woman, we often feel like we have to cut ourselves off. We have to wall off the vulnerable, soft parts of ourselves to get through so that we're not hurt. But we can't just reopen that for the joy. And when you do that, like, you know, you get to live. Like, I live more fully in these moments than I ever thought was possible for myself. And that's been one of the beautiful, like, plus sides to what can often be, you know, really painful work.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that ties in so perfectly with why racism exists. I think a lot of it has to do with this disembodiment, right? This like intellectualizing things, ignoring things, walling ourselves off. So I love hearing that you've stepped into that embodiment. And also the language of the book, it felt like it was written by a Black woman and like not in a monolithic, like, you know, language, but it was like, there were the moments when you were talking about your hair and I was like, yes, I get that feeling. And then also like languaging these statistics and the academics and all of it was in there and all of it was authentic. And I wondered, because I have also read books by people of color that I felt kind of had to bend to a certain language, had to fit into a certain mold. And I wondered if you ever battled with that pressure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, when I first started writing essays, that was like a promise I made to myself, was I was always going to have to recognize every word that was published if it had my name on it. And the few times where I didn't listen to my instinct, I immediately regretted it. And so I had learned right away. That's part of why I still, you know, have stayed like a freelancer over the years, was because I learned the power of someone trying to change your words and just saying, nope, I'm out, give it back.
Yeah.
I'm not publishing it, right? And you turn down that commission, whatever you have to do, so that you don't have something out there that's not your words. So when it came time for the book, you know, I always had this idea because I knew I didn't have a journalism degree. You know, I didn't have the internships. I didn't have the history in writing that people say, you know, you need in order to write for these publications. So I knew all I had really was my voice and my experience. And if I gave that up, you know, I always try to remind writing students this, that whiteness has no need for knockoff whiteness. It's just, it's not something that's of any service. They already have whiteness, you know? And so while at the time you may think that will pay off, it's never actually going to be something that they will ever choose over whiteness. And so I just figured my voice was all I had. So by the time it came to the book, I had already built a reputation on my voice, authentic as it was. And so I didn't have to fight. And we were really careful picking a publisher, picking an editor who actually respect and liked my work. And a lot of times I think we find that there are publishers, especially for books right now, because books on race are hot, right? Who want to sell, but they don't actually like the books. They don't actually like the writers they're publishing. They like their opportunity to make money. And, you know, my editor really liked me and liked my work. And the few squabbles we had where I was like, yeah, no, I'm not changing that. She was like, okay, cool. You know, and that was it. And so it ended up feeling like me. And the only thing I gave in on that still sticks in my craw was where she wanted me to explain what hoteps were. And I didn't want to explain what hoteps were. And I ended up explaining it a little bit. And the only saving grace is that some Black people find it funny the way I explained it, but I really wanted to be like, if you don't know what a hotep is, you can Google it, or you don't need to know. Like, you know, I wanted to leave that one part out, I was like, fine, you know. And that's the one where I'm always like, oh, why didn't I just leave that an inside, thing? But, that's it. That's the only time where the only thing I look at, I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have.
Keep that ours. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, we are going to move to the community question and answer, but I want to sneak in one more with you because I did get the sense reading the book, and I don't know if you speak on it explicitly, but I did get the sense that you kind of fell into having to write this book and then now hearing the full story. That definitely sounds like what it was. Like, I agree. I don't think people of color ever want to talk about race, and then we keep talking about race. But I also hear, these huge sacrifices that you have made in talking about race. You spoke today of losing your community and losing friendships because you began writing about this. And I also know that there have been some recent sacrifices and lack of safety in your world for you and your family. And so I guess my question is like, who, that sounds like kind of a death of a sort. Like, who is Ijeoma before writing about race and who is Ijeoma after?
Yeah, it's, I live in this world where there's these contradictions I'm always living with, where every day that I feel like unsafe, and I know I have to carry that with me, of like, if I get a letter and I don't know who it's from and I'm like panicked for a second, or, and checking and not being, no one can, people can't know where you live, and, all these things that I never lived with before, it can feel like you've lost something.
Yeah.
But then I also remember that every day I get to talk, like I get to be myself. I get to talk as a full Black woman, and I never had that before. And when I talk, like the real heroes out here doing this are the people who know, like, I have to feed my family, and this means I have to swallow this crap down every day. Like, yeah. Oh my God. And I remember that life. And I've been in I remember I did this program at an Ivy, and they invited me, and I don't know why. I think there was a mix-up. I have no idea. I was the only person who wasn't representing a corporation. And it was a social justice thing, social issues thing. And every person of color there, you could see them when something slightly racist or very racist would happen. Right. Tense up. And you could see the calculations. Like, do I speak now and risk these relationships? Do I speak now and, or do I wait, or what happens? I remembered that life. And oh my goodness, no matter how difficult it can be. And absolutely, I want to keep my family safe. And that's, I can't go back to that. Like, I can't, and I want the freedom to say, this is messed up. This shouldn't happen. This happened to me. I want that for every person. I want that sort of, because that pain of having to spend 10 hours a day in a space where you can't be your whole self, where, at any time, any kind of, truth that you decide to blurt out is going to put you at risk. It's not a life I want to live. So, I always, when I think about, because there have definitely been times where I thought, like, what if I just didn't do this? And then I could like have people over to my house, and I could feel, like free. If I gave that up, I'm still a Black woman at the end of the day in a world that doesn't want me to be a whole person, and at least now I can say it. And so that's kind of where I live with it right now. It shouldn't be like that. I mean, I shouldn't have to make that choice. None of us should, but that's the reality.
Yes, thank you for stepping into it and stepping into your power and owning what is going on. It has helped so many people. It's definitely helped me and inspired me.
Thank you.
So our first community question by KJ Carter. Can you talk about your personal experiences with intersectionality, being a person of color, a Black woman, as well as a queer woman?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I would say it's, intersectionality is one of the foundations of the work I do. The lack of intersectionality in how we do this work, and how we address issues of race, and how we address queer politics, and how we address feminism makes me as a Black queer woman inherently unsafe, the same way it would make, a disabled Black person, a trans or non-binary Black person inherently unsafe. And what it means is that, even when you're doing the work, the people that are supposed to be allied with you, people that you're supposed to be on a team with, are constantly kind of undercutting you. And it's difficult, but yet I would also say, as someone who writes from multiple marginalized identities, it also keeps intersectionality at the front of my brain in the way in which I think that often it's not for other people, right? The idea of like remembering, I exist in multiple ways. I bring multiple pieces of myself in here. There are probably pieces that I'm not seeing that I need to check for. But it also means that, you know, if I'm writing something about race, I would get, yes, this is beautiful from all sorts of Black people. And then I write, but then white women are like, come on, you're a woman first. And then I'm writing about feminism and I'm being called a bedwench, you know? And it means that the circle of people who actually have my back, who I can actually count on, is very, 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 very small.
Yeah.
And knowing that and being aware of that sad truth is necessary to not find yourself completely, you know, alone when you need support the most. But, you know, where I embrace it, where I remember it, where I remember what it feels like to have a huge part of yourself disregarded, helps me be better at my work and helps me, you know, better address when I mess it up, you know, which we all do.
Right.
So intersectionality is vital to me, to my writing, to my understanding of these issues and solutions towards social issues. And it's something that we could all stand to do a lot better.
Perfect. Next question. So, so for me, it was the healing. I love that. I didn't feel alone anymore. Black people talk, but we don't talk. Otherwise, it'd be constant crying. And I think the question for me in there is Black people not talking? What do you make of that?
You know, I think it's a mix, right? So part of what I think, honestly, is we've absorbed this kind of Western idea that we handle things on our own. I'm going to probably swear a little bit here. Sorry, y'all. I don't know if that's
Please, can we?
But like this idea that you're on your own all the time, this like westernized, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Right.
But I've recognized that's a violation of who we are as people. Like communities of color, I don't know any communities of color where they're like, you get there on your own. We've always gotten through, and especially I would say as Black people in the United States, we've always gotten through together. But even like in Nigeria, where my roots are, that's how you get by. But we've kind of been bought into this whole thing that you have to survive, you have to strive, you have to do it on your own, you don't have time. That is a luxury to build community, to have community support. But the truth is that's what we need. We need community for various things, right? I need community sometimes to not talk about this at all. Like I need community sometimes where I can feel safe talking about movies I love and know that nothing weird and racist is going to pop up, you know, and make me feel unsafe. Sometimes I need community to vent and know I'm not alone. Sometimes I need community to level set and recognize what it means to be in a space where you are respected and seen and heard. But we need it and we need to prioritize it. There's this idea that the struggle, you know, to free America from white supremacy is our struggle, and it's not.
Right. Our
struggle is to survive and to thrive. We have to engage with violent white supremacy where it stops us from doing that. But the work, the duty for that work actually needs to lie within whiteness. And that means that we have to be spending more time in community, and it's necessary. But it also means one thing that happens that I've noticed, like living in Seattle, and I don't know if this is the same in Boulder, because while I used to go to Boulder a lot, I worked there. I didn't have a lot of friends. Is that when you're in a majority white space and you don't feel safe talking about this, you get in a group and suddenly it's all you talk about, and it can be really traumatic because you wanted maybe to, like I remember having a birthday party, was it 2 years ago? And everyone was crying. Like, because we hadn't all been together in a space, you know, and so there were all these people working in these white spaces, and suddenly everyone was crying. And I had to leave and go sit with white people for a while because I'm like, I'm sorry, but it's my birthday. I just can't. This has been an hour of crying. I need to go sit with carefree white folk who don't carrying this pain. Please continue on. And I left my partner there, and I was like, honey, this is your birthday gift for me, is to sit here and you know, absorb this while I take a break, take a breather, you know. And so I think like it's all because we don't have the time, because we don't get to prioritize it, and we need to. We have to find a way, because we won't get through this on our own.
Right. And I have to emphasize what you said. Our job is to thrive. Our job is to live and only deal with white supremacy where it stops us. And I completely agree. And I'm astonished at the fact that it's been, 400 plus years of violence and Black people are still like, let me tell you what racism is. And it's like, why are we doing this? This should not be our job. So yeah, I really want to drive that home. Okay, next question. So what do you think the monetary equivalent of being a BIPOC, managing tension and microaggression and educating people in the majority white spaces?
So like, how much do you think you should get paid for this work? Because
I guess that's the question.
I mean, I would say, yeah, it's worth it. I think it's important to recognize, right, the system of race is first and foremost an economic system, right? It was built to support violent capitalism. And so therefore, we can't get to anti-racism off the free labor of populations of color. Like, that's not how that works. So it's worth whatever you think it's worth, like, honestly, because you don't have to do it. So shoot for the moon. I don't do any of this for free. Right. At all. Even before people were asking me to, people would ask me questions online and be like, I'll tell you that for $20. I'll tell you that for $50. And I'll tell you that for $100. Or, you know what? I don't need the money, so I'm not telling you, right? Like, it's just how, but it needs to be valued. And so the truth is where you're doing this in spaces, if you're not getting paid for it, then they don't value it. Right. And that means that what you do, it's not going to make progress.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. And I tell people of color, charge anything, because money, it doesn't mean anything. So charge whatever you feel. I agree. Yeah. So can you talk about how race and many other social classifications is so useful and reinforced by capitalism? How is race reinforced by capitalism?
Yeah, I would say they reinforce each other. So it's important to recognize, and I say this in the book too, the system of race wasn't like the result of some longstanding grudge that white people had against Black people. Or like, finally, I'm going to enslave the people of Africa. No, it was, I have this land that needs to be worked as cheaply as possible. And it's against our moral, ethical codes to enslave the white people here, and the Native people we can't. We've tried to, and we went the whole genocide route. So we're going to enslave people, and then we're going to build a story that justifies something that's so, horrific. And so that's the story of race. And so race was literally created to justify economic exploitation and genocide. Right. And so they work together. And the modern day story of race is now the pyramid scheme that we call white supremacy, which is basically the idea that what you get out of these systems is power over populations of color if you are a white person. And what it does then is it divorces your idea of success from anything measurable, from economic success, from any academic success or accomplishment, and it instead becomes purely comparative. And so you are successful as long as you are better than. If you are better than populations of color, if you are better than women, because patriarchy is a huge part of this as well, then you're successful. And what that does then is it enables people at the head of our major corporations, people in power, to take all that is measurable, i.e. capital, land, for themselves, and have you looking at things that are only comparative. And so they can take 90%, but since you've always been told that what you need to be looking is down to see what percentage they have, you don't even notice that. And it really means that when you're looking at how you feel and whether you feel successful, you're not actually looking at your income. You're not actually looking at your financial safety or well-being. You're not actually looking at your feeling of your inherent feeling of accomplishment or whether something really fulfills. What you're looking at is, am I doing better than the people I've been told I'm supposed to be better than? Wow. And so that's really how it keeps capitalism running, because capitalism cannot afford for everyone to have a measurable idea of success, for everyone to actually have capital, to actually receive profits from their labor. And so they have to come up with a story that is fungible. You know, they have to come up with a story that they can continuously move and weave and divorce from measurable gains.
Well said. Yeah. So, my white coworker is celebrated for their work on diversity, but I am not even thanked or recognized for my work on diversity. Whew. How can I address this without getting fired?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's real. So studies have shown that basically everyone who isn't a white man is punished for work and diversity. And the level to which you are punished will be with your gender and your skin tone, right? Mm-hmm. So white men are the only people kind of lauded for doing work on diversity. White women are punished slightly, women of color even more, you know, Black men even more, right? It's all kind of how you fall away. And basically it's this idea, right? This mistrust of people of color that, you know, that they have, because they're the ones who have quote unquote skin in the game, right? So, oh, you're doing this for selfish reasons. It seems selfless if you're a white man doing this work, and therefore you are trusted, right? And the only way there's the only ways around it is to honestly make people aware of it. And so I would say if you don't want to get fired, right, then it isn't going to be pointing at someone who obviously has favor, right? And say they're getting what I shouldn't have, is instead to point towards the tendency. So I would say actually pull up those studies, and there are actual studies done around it, and say, hey, I don't know if you saw this, but this is the truth. And this is also why we see, you know, when it comes to the growing industry of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that so much of it is dominated by light skin or white passing or white queer people who kind of feel like I can represent this entire space, even though they are often the least marginalized in that space. So I would say pull up the studies around it, you know, so Google that, like there are academic studies around it, pull those articles up and say, look here, this is kind of what we're experiencing. And so, because there are studies where they would give, you know, they would show like, you know, these kind of write-ups of employees and then say, who would you give a better evaluation to? And time again, if they put like work towards equity in there, if you were a person of color, your evaluation was lower. And that was by your peers, by supervisors, and by people working for you. So I would say, you know, show the study so that people can recognize what they're doing, because they may well not recognize it at all. This is one of the hardest things to get over. I see it all the time when I talk to people who even are read up on this, especially for white people, and they'll be like, how do we, so-and-so is supposed to do this work, but she's so angry, and I get it because she's lived it, but how can I make her less angry? I'm like, no, you let her be angry. And maybe you think she's angry because you're assuming that because she's a person of color, that she's going to be more sensitive or emotional around it. But it's her life, you know, and it doesn't mean that what she's saying isn't true. And so I would say that it's bring the facts where you can. But also share it with that person, because if they're genuinely trying to do this work, not be aware of how they are benefiting from this, and they may well, if they are genuine about it, be someone who's heard bringing it up, you know?
Yeah, peer to their values. I like that. So, managing conversations on race with a white partner, feel you, who just doesn't get it, reconciling tough topics and coping with the exhaustion that comes along with these types of conversations.
Whew, I feel you. Like I've been partnered with white people in the past. It is very difficult. Honestly, I don't even think it's something I could do again, because I can't explain it day in and day out for my job and then come home and explain it some more. Like that just sounds like a nightmare for me. But I get it. Like you fell in love with someone, and that's the relationship you're in. And I want that to work, and I want that to be healthy for people who are in those spaces. You know, one thing I would recommend that I have found works, like with my mom, who is white, is it's important to recognize like where the fear or the resistance or the refusal to see comes from. And often it comes from this fear, this thought that if we bring in the reality of these lived experiences into this room, it's going to pull us apart, because we're going to be aware of how different we are, right? Wow. There's this myth that being in love with someone means you know everything about them, you understand them. And It's not true, right? It's you bring your differences in and you learn to appreciate, you try to see, but you can't live someone else's life. And so what I found, this is the technique I use that can often work, is I imagine for myself what my relationship with that person would look like if they got it. And it's not if they magically understood everything. It's if they got how to listen, if they learned, if we worked out a process to kind of deal with these issues and make a progress and get better, where I'm not having to repeat myself over and over again. And maybe we tackle this problem, move on to the next, and I don't have to go back and tackle that problem again. Like, what would that look like? Where I felt safe, where I felt like I could bring up an issue and it wouldn't be a fight, it would be listening. You know, what would that mean? And what would it mean to me? How would I feel about them? And I kind of draw that all out. And then I present it to that person and say, I want this with you. This is what I want with you. And this is what I think we can do because I know you love me, because I think you want it too. Yeah. And then you say, what is stopping that from happening? And so I want to feel like this with you. I think we could do this. And I don't feel it because this is happening, not you're doing this thing, you know, and this is honestly, this is strategy, right? So sometimes people are doing shit that you're like, you know what, stop. And honestly, if you feel like someone's not interested in working with you, someone isn't trying to help, they don't want to see you and know you better, they don't want to work over those issues, they want you to just flatten that part of yourself, then you are not in a healthy relationship. Right. And so part of why I like this strategy is because if you offer it up, and someone says yes, you have a thing to work towards. If you offer it up and they say no, you know you have to walk away because you will not get, the will is not there to have that fundamentally changed relationship. So that's really kind of all I have as far as that. But it has worked for me. Like even, you know, with my mom offering up what I want, you know, what I imagined our relationship could be if I could openly talk about these issues, if she could hear me and not immediately think I'm calling her the worst mother in the world, right? Like what that would mean, it would mean that we would talk more regularly, that she could hear about my work, that she wouldn't awkwardly, you know, be tiptoeing around it, that she could show up at events and be proud and be like, I'm that mother, you know, and that's what we have. And we still have issues. It's still a fairly regular basis where I'm like, I can't believe you just said that thing, but it's a different thing, you know? Through it. And I know that when I bring it up, she's not going to start crying and freak out and say that, you know, think that it means that we're not close. Me bringing it up means we are close, you know, and it's become a part of why we're close.
Yeah. And I loved reading that transformation of her going from, I'm not reading anything you do to like, listen to what I did. That was amazing. And I'll say personally, I am in relationship with a white partner and I gave them Me and White Supremacy and, you know, they had to read it every Saturday, like so that we could at least have shared language, you know what I mean? And like, yeah. And I think that dedication, which you spoke to, like shows you if the relationship is valued or not. And if it's not, then you know what you have to do. Absolutely. So, could you describe your choice to counsel talking about race versus being anti-racist? Wondering because someone objected to me being on a bipartisan civil rights group for being anti-racist.
I mean, I don't know why someone objected to it. I think maybe they don't understand what being anti-racist means.
Right. It doesn't seem like there's a difference to me.
There's no anti-racism is the action of taking apart racism.
Right.
So, you know, you talk about it to find out what needs to happen, and then you do the thing. And doing the thing is the anti-racism. Right. So that's it. Like it honestly sounds like whoever had a problem just didn't understand it. Part of it too is, okay, so there's a fundamental, there's this huge backlash, always has been, against race theory and against the idea that society is inherently racist. And that's something that I believe probably more so than Ibram does, honestly. And so the idea of being an anti-racist, for many people feels like, oh, you think that white America is broken and it's not, and people don't want to see that fundamental truth. So really it's people who don't know history, don't know how these things work, and don't want to actually look and say, and people who want to keep it on a personal level. So it's people who want to say, I just want to keep talking forever. I want to make better friends, and not I want to do anything about our systems. That's not what I'm here for. That's not what I think anyone really honestly doing this work is here for. And so really it's a willful, often, misunderstanding of the work. And I would, I am an anti-racist, 100%. And Ibram's an anti-racist, and we don't even agree in what that looks like. We're all anti-racist. We're doing this work trying to pull racism apart, and whiteness will change it and say, oh, this means this, and you're in this school and you're in this. We're all trying to just pull it apart. But at the end, we all want it to be action. And that's where people will push back often against the idea of anti-racism, because they want to keep it touchy-feely, and they don't want it to actually get to the idea that our systems are inherently racist, that our society is inherently racist, and we need to do the work.
It reminds me of the Al Sharpton chapter about Martin Luther King and how that was portrayed versus Malcolm X, whereas Martin Luther King, as you reveal in the book, was hated by white people at the time, was very radical. And here are these two figures who had a similar, who had at core the same beliefs and visions, and maybe went about it a slightly different way, but that was exasperated. At the time. So interesting. So why do you believe reparations for Blacks has not happened yet? I believe lack of healthcare, equal education, etc. cannot be resolved until Black people have this. Interesting.
I mean, it hasn't happened yet because the United States has absolutely no desire. I mean, why would it? The United States still runs off of the economic exploitation of populations of color. What would reparations even look like in a hyper-capitalist system that still requires the labor and exploitation of Black people? You would have to stop that for the reparations to actually work. And we don't want to have that reckoning. We don't want to, because people have to believe. I think it's really important that people understand that in our society, in American society, in order for our capitalist system to work, white people have to believe that everything they got, they earned, and everything they don't have is because they haven't earned it.
Yikes.
That's the only way you can keep showing up at your job that underpays you, that exploits you, without wanting to burn the building down.
Yeah.
So what does reparations mean then? Reparations mean that an entire population was stolen from, that this was built off of the exploited labor, that maybe what you have you didn't earn, that maybe the system's unfair, maybe the system's stealing from you too. Why would we have reparations there? It is absolutely against the interests of white supremacy, and it is basically fatal to our capitalist system to try to do that, because then you also have white people saying, wait a minute, so this means I've been screwed too. And they have. And then it all falls apart. And so I absolutely, of course, I believe in reparations. I would love to see reparations. Will I see it? Probably not in any meaningful way, because that would honestly destroy the systems we have. But I would love to see it. I would love to see that.
I'm here for it.
I don't think that will happen. I don't see in any way why it's in the interest of white America. And so we do these weird pseudo reparations, buy a Black woman coffee. That's not reparations. It's nice, thank you, I'll take it. But that's not reparations, we try to come up with these things to make us feel better, that in no way really do anything to challenge the way in which capitalism has robbed us for multiple generations of the ability to survive.
And I hear that theme forming of I want to feel good. I don't want to deal with the system that is. Okay, yeah, word. Whew, this is enlightening. What is it that empowers you to withstand the oppressiveness that you experience as a Black woman?
I have to constantly keep in mind that I am fighting for Black people. And I think that we can forget that. We can think we're fighting against something and not for something.
Right.
So when I remember that, and this is my partner was just telling me the other day, he was getting so frustrated with me because I had completely lost track of it. And I was talking about my work, that if I believe Black Lives Matter, I am a Black life. So why would I want less for me?
Exactly.
How in any way can I find victory at the end of this if I am not investing in myself and in my community, if I'm not spending time in Black joy? And I would say, if you're a person of color, it's important to recognize that what you're fighting for is the ability to thrive, for your communities to be strong and healthy. And that means you have to check in, because you have to understand the number one truth, which is that no one will care for your community but you. No one's going to do that work in the meantime. So while you're out fighting white supremacy, doing this battle that's going to come up tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, no one is caring for your community. No one is caring for your family. No one is caring for you. And if what you're actually fighting for is your ability to thrive, for your community to be strong, that's the most important work. And that's what I have to remember, because white supremacy will outlive me. So if white supremacy outlives me, then what's my victory?
Ooh.
Right? My victory then has to be how I thrive, how my community thrives.
Absolutely.
There is no other victory in my life. And so that's what I have to keep in mind. And that's what I hope that other people do too. And if I am not spending at least as much time uplifting myself and my community as I am fighting white supremacy, I'm losing. Because white supremacy will still be there, and I will be gone, and I will not have lived. And that's a loss.
I'm speechless. And I appreciate that reminder, because I feel it in my body, the constriction around, like, I want my joy, I want my peace. And then there's also what I recognize is the system of oppression, is the internalized racism that says, no, you shouldn't be. You should be fighting for this. You should be fighting against this. You should be in the streets. You should be doing this. Thank you for that. Thank you for that affirmation of our life and our joy. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Amos Wilson said the education is good if it teaches children to solve the problems that confront them and their communities. Can Black children then ever be could get a good education in America?
I mean, the one thing that's interesting about education is public education in the United States has always been a classist, racist institution and sexist institution. The first universities in the United States gave degrees by rank, not by field of study, not by grades. It was your family rank is how you got your degrees. It was really a finishing school for rich white men. And from there, we expanded that definition of power, right? And slowly made space. I do not believe that I have yet to come across, there's no district in this country that is giving an adequate education to children of color, especially Black children, especially Indigenous children. But I would also say, if you're an Asian student, good luck ever coming across anything that actually reflects how you live your life or teaches you about, the contributions that Asian Americans have made to society in school, right? Every population of color is completely erased and dehumanized in our public education system. But I would say, if there is a system we have that could be changed to be made into something healthy, before anything else, it's going to be education.
Yeah.
Why? Well, partially because of the amount of power that parents actually do have in the system, whether they know how and how to exercise it or not. The fact that we do vote for our school boards, the fact that you can actually annoy schools into changing their practices. I've seen this, I've done this. And the fact that many teachers do fundamentally love students. And so then it is about how we reframe and how we look at this system, but also this pandemic. I have spent so much time in schools over the years, and so many times I've heard excuses as to why we can't do what we're doing. But if there is one system that was able to completely remake itself in 6 months, it's our public education system. So what that means is we actually do have systems in place that can completely reform. Like, we can't just say no more capitalism without a bloody revolution right now, right? But we can actually say we're going to completely change the way we educate children. How do I know this? Because my kid is, learning downstairs right now in a place where teachers barely knew how computers worked 6 months ago, right? So what it means is that we actually can, when we decide it's in the best interest of our children, completely reform how this massive system works. And that gives me hope that we can do this for schools. And so then it's about will. Then it's about how and where, and whether or not we decide it's as important as it is, getting our kids through this pandemic. And so I think we can. Are we? No. I think we have moments. I think there are some teachers who try, but usually it's teachers acting out on their own. It's almost never school. Some school districts are a little better than others. But I do believe I have more hope about what can happen in education than any other system we have.
Yeah. It's not supported by the system. If it is, it's a teacher who's doing their best without any support. Yeah. Okay, Thanksgiving is around the corner, and are there kind and productive ways to set up boundaries ahead of time, knowing that my family and I are on completely different sides of the political spectrum?
Oh man, I'm so glad that I am in a liberal atheist family, because Thanksgiving is then it's just about who's mad at each other. It's so nice, we're not talking just because someone's regular things.
Just actual interpersonal conflict.
Exactly. Like, we don't even do Thanksgiving on Thanksgiving because it's a racist holiday. But we have dinner that week, and if we're not fighting. So I would say some things is important that can help. One is to figure out, I think before you go into these situations, think what's my definition of success? Like, if this was a good night where I'm like, not perfect, but I came through unscathed. I didn't cry. I didn't feel unsafe. What does that look like? And then think, okay, based on my past experiences, where has this not happened? Where has this failed? What has stopped this, and what could make it easier? Once you define that, pick a few things, like whether it's someone who needs to not sit next to you, whether it's just a general conversation of like, hey, can we just please not bring up the election, right? And
you did it. You brought it up.
Yeah. And then take that to someone that can support you, who's open to it, and say, how can we make this happen? And use the kind of the general, propose a good meal. Like, I would love it if we got together and this time no one started crying, and this time someone wasn't calling someone a snowflake. Like, it would be really great if that happened. And this is what I think could make it work, and keep it simple, right? So don't aim for perfect, because then people will be like, you just put 20 rules on a dinner. Think, what are the few things that would stop? And then also have, be really clear about like what your kind of boundaries are. So you can say, if this is talked about, I will just get up and leave. And that, and say that, and be willing and know that you have the right to do that, that you don't need to sit through anything that's harmful. You don't at all. And communicating that ahead of time, say, I'm not going to make a scene or whatever, but I will get up, because I don't, sit down and eat dinner in an abusive situation. That's not what I want for the night. And so know like what those boundaries are, communicate that to your partner or to whomever in the family you feel is sympathetic, so they know. And then stick to it. Honestly, people will get together again like next year or won't. But knowing that you have boundaries, and also people need to know that like respecting your boundaries as a person, respecting you as a person, is part of how you get to spend time with that person. Like family are not people that we get to dump all over. We don't get to hold up all of these things that we wouldn't say to people we respect, to our coworkers, things like that. We don't get to wait till we're at Thanksgiving to dump it on someone. These relationships are not unconditional. And I think it's healthy to say, like, my company requires that I feel safe. And it's not that you always agree with me, but have those boundaries and know what they are and communicate that.
Yeah. And I'll add that, and I hear it in your story that boundaries get easier when you do them. And that's really the only way to do them is just do it. Because it's tough, but the more that you do it, the more you can stick to it.
You have one awkward thing where you get up, and they know that you mean it. And then if they have to go to work again, they don't say the thing again. You know, like sometimes it's just that simple of realizing it's easier to not do the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so talk about terms BIPOC and Latinx and how woke culture didn't include us, people of color, in creating these terms, especially because Latin America was named by Napoleon III. So the term itself, it is colonialist.
So I would say when it comes to Latinx, yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of debate, like from various parts of community saying we love this and don't. I absolutely believe we always have the right to refer to ourselves and name ourselves. I think that that's vital and important. But I also regularly hear from queer members of that community that they appreciate Latinx because it's the closest to being seen that often queer, trans, non-binary people are in community. Where it comes to BIPOC, this is the way I feel about BIPOC. So BIPOC, I actually think really came from community as segment of community. It's still very much split. Like many people, POC, I go back and forth in between them, but that was born out of a frustration. And this is that Black and Indigenous people, that BIPOC was becoming this blanket that allowed the further erasure of Black and Indigenous people. And that you could just say people of color, and it didn't matter who you were focused on, you checked a box. And so often people would say, well, we have, we're 20% POC, we're very diverse, without actually looking at the fact that maybe one Black person is in that group, or no Indigenous people are in that group. And I've even seen this when it comes to methodology around studies. I remember sitting with economic think tanks and asking them where they gathered their data, and they're like, well, we regularly interview people of color. And I was like, cool, how many Indigenous people? And the whole group saying they had never surveyed a household, an Indigenous household before, right? So but it also speaks to the very specific ways in which Black and Indigenous populations have been violently exploited, murdered, and oppressed in the United States. And that there's a special attention and a special way in which the state interacts with us that's different from how it interacts with other populations of color. And that's really what BIPOC is. So BIPOC was really a way of dealing with that frustration of being erased by POC.
Right.
BIPOC is quickly becoming POC. I've been BIPOC'd and I realized I've been POC'd, where people are like, someone just told me I was doing a business thing and they're like, oh, well, we asked a bunch of BIPOCs and I look and there's no Black people. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. So that's where we are now. And so I think what's really important is honestly what we mean and how specific we are when we need to be specific.
Yeah.
When it comes to, looking at Latina, Latinx communities, it's also really important to recognize that race and ethnicity are two different things. And so this means that within that, we have further erasure and exploitation and oppression of Afro-Latinx people, right? And that when we talk about race, one of my frustrations often is people saying, when I say Black, they're like, well, you left out Latinx people, but Afro-Latinx people exist. So that's a further erasure of it. And so what it means is that we do have to be specific about what we're talking about. When we're talking about race, when we're talking about ethnicity, why these terms matter, we have to make sure that we are, when we're talking about an issue that's impacting a population, that we're being specific about the population, that there is no way that we can let it be, vague. But it's also really important to recognize that no matter what terms we use, white supremacy will exploit and manipulate those terms for their benefit. And so we have to just be aware of how it's being used. And instead of, I personally believe, instead of constantly coming up with new terms, because we're also doing, are we an ally or an accomplice, right? You know what? So white people, I've seen white people call themselves accomplices with the same breath that they call themselves allies, and it means the same thing to them, which is they have a Black Lives Matter sign in their window, and that's it, right? So it's really important that we actually look at what the actions are. But also at the same time, like, I use BIPOC not because it means much to me, but because I also know how triggering at this point POC is to a lot of Black and Indigenous people. And so for me, it's harm reduction. But I would give it a year before BIPOC feels the same way, you know? And so it gets really complicated, and it's about how we define these things for ourselves.
So this is our last question. Oh, I'm so sad. Okay, Ijeoma, how did it feel when the gentleman who introduced tonight's session called your book a story? Did that moment stand out to you?
I don't know. You know, it didn't hit me any particular way for a couple of reasons. One, I guess because what I saw was what he seemed to be talking to was my story as it exists and how it connected with it. It's always weird for me when like white people introduce my story when I'm like, okay, but my story's in the book. But I didn't see it as this is a fantasy or space. I saw it as I did put my story in there. You know, it's my truth. It's my life. It's always weird. Like even when people call me a novelist, I get like, wait, what? Is that what I'm doing? Is that's weird to me? And that ends up being a strange thing that we need to talk about. But I also think my work exists in this hybrid space that people don't quite know how to categorize. The one thing I would say in general, and this actually doesn't really have a lot to do with how I was introduced, but this happens a lot, is I really want people to understand that my story and my work is for me and my community first and foremost. And even if whiteness gets a lot out of it, it's still for me and my community first and foremost. So there is this tendency for people to think, for whiteness, to think I write for it. And I don't.
Right.
I recognize white people will read my work. I recognize white people need to. But that's not who I write for. And I think that that's an important thing for people to understand. And when they're engaging with my work and the work with, honestly, many writers of color, the idea is, oh, I got to take this trip into someone's life. Thank you. And people will literally email me, thank you for writing this book for me. I didn't write it for you, you know? And that assumption is painful. And I'm not all saying that happened here, but I want people to understand that tendency to happen. Right. But it is my story. And it's the story of many other Black women. It's one of countless stories we have, one of countless stories that many Black people, Black femmes, you know, plenty of BIPOCs have that all need to be heard. And so I hope that people understand that also my story isn't the Black story. Right. It's a Black story.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also see that on the flip side of, I experience a lot of white people being like, hey, I don't feel included in what you're saying. And I'm like, you're not supposed to. Like, this isn't centering you, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's so much out there. Like, why does everything? And I want to get to the point where there are so many voices out there that you regularly feel like, oh, okay, this isn't for me, but this might be, or this is, or this is, or this is, or maybe none of it is. And you're okay as a white person for realizing that not everything has to be. I think white people need to get a lot more comfortable with the idea that not everything has to be for them, because we have to live that most of our life. I turn on the TV, not for me. I obey laws not built for me. You know, I'm participating in an economy not built for me. You know, all of these things, none of this is built for me, and I still manage. And so I think it's vital that if we are going to get to a better space, that white people let go of the idea that everything has to be for them.
Yeah, well said. Okay, thank you so much for talking with me.
I really enjoyed it.
Yes, same. And at this point, I want to welcome back Patrice Maduri.
Thank you so much, Ijeoma, Assétou, and our ASL interpreters.
Yes, thank
Tonight,
you.
it is our sincere hope that this conversation will be a conduit that leads to many moments of growth and progress in the weeks, months, and years to come.